Valois Point Claire has had many different eras. You see, in history, you can look at anywhere in the world, for example, and see that an area, had a beginning, it peaked, and then it had a decline. And then maybe some hundreds of years later, they would have another beginning, and then it would peak, and then it would decline. Valois has had many of those. Now, I don't mean decline like it was, the Middle Ages here, like it was medieval town here in Valois, but to say that it was a farming community and it peaked as a farming community before the railroad tracks came in, I think would be an honest statement. And then as the railroad tracks came in, of course, a lot of the farming communities were bought up. So you can consider that a slight decline. And then you have, not cottage country, but resort town. The resort town came in, it peaked, let's say in the 1880s or the early 1900s. And then by the 1920s, people start to settle in, you get a different crowd here. And then of course, with the Great Depression, you have the decline. Also with the 1920s is that you have another peak that starts to happen, which is residential. People start to move into this area. You start to get families who are here in the wintertime. And if you have families who are here in the wintertime, then you have families who are experiencing this time of year, Christmas, in Valois for the first time in its history. Again, not excluding the families who had been here, the farming families. The Valois family, for example, who lived on where Valois Park is. But certainly in the 1920s, you get a lot of advertisements in the newspapers, and you get a lot of people coming in and living in what is now Valois Bay Avenue, Prince Edward, Queens, and Kings. Now in the 1930s, because of the Great Depression, you do get a slight decline in the growth of Valois, but people nevertheless are still coming and moving into this area. Let me digress just for a second and continue with, one of the things, or one of the motivators for this series is the fact that it's getting harder and harder to find people who would have clear memories of the early 1950s, for example, which is a very important era for me, because that's when a lot of this became developed. That was the earliest days of what we now consider suburbia here in Point Claire. It's when the big change happened between farming community and suburb. What we all enjoy today. A lot of that happened in the 50s. Of course, you could say it started in 46 when the Veterans Land Act happened. But again, I digress on that as well. Now, finding people to speak on behalf of the 50s is getting harder and harder. So that means finding people who could speak on behalf of the 1940s is even harder than that. And that would be incredible if I could find someone who could speak on behalf of the 40s, because then they can say, I remember when it was all farm, and then I remember when it started to shift. And just the juxtaposition of the two, I think, is a beautiful thing to remember and to catalog and to capture on this series. That's the whole point of this. But what if I was to find someone who remembers the 1930s? Well before the Veterans Land Act, well before a lot of this area became suburbanized, quote unquote. Well, that's what's happened, actually. I've been in touch with someone who moved to Valois with her family in 1933. So you have to understand the landscape of Valois in that era was very interesting, because it was at the end of that country club era. So it still had some of the features of that era. For example, the Valois Country Club extending out into the water in Valois Bay, built in the 20s. You had the Chateau St. Louis, which was built almost just next to the Valois Country Club, north of the Lakeshore Highway. Lakeshore was a highway. It was the only highway. There was no 20 at the time. Anyway, so the Chateau St. Louis was still there. But that's all below the tracks. Above the tracks, where people were moving in, there really wasn't much. Donegal wasn't really built up. If it was mostly residential. And there was only 2 stores, really, both kind of on the corner of Valois Bay Avenue and Donegal. So it was a very, very different era, because not too long after that, things start to build up. 1933 is even before the train station, Valois train station was built, and also before that old post office building was built. But to get someone who has memories of this area during Christmas time, I mean, I don't even know. I can't even find the words to tell you how moving it is, honestly. I can't even tell you how valuable this story is. Only time will be able to tell you how important this story is. 50 years from now, or 20 or 10 years from now, when a lot of those people from that generation are gone. And we can't hear anymore. It just won't be available. What Christmas time was like in that era, in the area that we all live in. And I'm sure her story matches a lot of the stories from those who lived, maybe in the Beaurepaire region or in the Saint Anne de Bellevue area or different areas of Lachine and Dorval and so on. So, unfortunately, Margaret wasn't able to pick up the phone and do an interview, or I wasn't able to do a Zoom with her. She was only available by email, which I still think is quite charming. It adds a little bit of mystique to it, because you don't really hear what she sounds like. So, and especially if you're doing it that way, you really have to make sure that you're writing it down in a way that the reader understands the emotion. And I think she did that a little bit. Though this is a video, and a lot of what I do is audio-visual, so I wanted to be able to provide something to you that you would be able to consume this way. So what I did was, I had my wife, Nadia Lawand, who is a professional voiceover artist, read out Margaret's account, and I coupled that with some footage that I shot of Valois during the last snowstorm, and with a little bit of music. So it's up to you. You can watch the screen while listening, or you can treat it as an old-timey radio show, an old story that was on the radio back in the 30s, the way Margaret used to listen to her entertainment long before TVs. You can treat it like that. Nevertheless, here is Margaret's account of what Christmas was like when she was a little girl in Valois, Pointe Claire, in the 1930s. Enjoy.
Hello, Jason. I'm sorry, but you will be disappointed with my recollections of early Christmases. I've been thinking back and can't find anything especially interesting to anyone except me. I remember I was only 5 when I moved to Valois in 1933, and at that age, in those days anyway, you just accepted that Christmas was just there every year, and you just enjoyed it and didn't think much deeper than that. Much was very similar to what we do today, except there was not all the razzle-dazzle of this present time. Also, we had no TV or cell phones, etc., to constantly hype it up. We didn't have access to all the Christmas advertising, bright outdoor decoration, lighted reindeer on lawns and roofs, big fat blown-up snowmen, big lighted lawn displays. Lots of loud, very secular music, starting Christmas advertising the day after Halloween, that are available today. The music on the radio featured a lot of Christmas carols, jingle bells, and Santa Claus is coming to town and choirs. Santa Claus was available for visiting at Eaton's in downtown Montreal, but that was quite an expedition to get there. Santa Claus was available for visiting at Eaton's in downtown Montreal, but that was quite an expedition to get there. In the 1930s, Valois was fairly new and didn't have a lot of organizations to arrange a lot of stuff. I don't remember ever going to see Santa at a store in Valois, as we didn't really have any stores in Valois then, apart from 2 small grocery stores. But I do remember my mom taking me into town, Montreal, to see him at Eaton's store and admire their Christmas window. My family and all my friends and neighbors all had a real Christmas tree, which we decorated a few days before Christmas. And we liked to go and see others' tree. Everyone chose either a Scotch pine, which was a shorter, wider tree, or a regular spruce, taller and more triangular, like most evergreens, which my family preferred. I never thought much about where my dad went to buy the tree, but I have a very hazy recollection that it was either at a place up on the old Dorval Road, later widened and made into Côte de Liesse, or if not there, then at a farm on Sources Road. The tree always had such a nice smell all the time it was up in the house. Of course, we all had our preferred way of decorating. Packages of silver tinsel, about 10 to 12-inch lengths, were very popular to hang on the branches, as well as the colored balls. Some people put lots and lots of tinsel, so that was almost all you could see, while others of us put a more modest amount, letting the colored balls show more clearly. Some people made paper chains to put on the tree as well, but I preferred ours without. Then, too, there was always a string of colored lights on the tree to turn on when we were in the room Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Every year in November, my mother would make a big, very rich, dark fruit cake, plus a light one as well, as a delicious, rich Christmas pudding made with suet, and to be served with a hard sauce made of butter, brown sugar, and moistened with wine. My dad would help her to mix the cake with their hands, as it was very heavy with all the fruit, butter, and sugar. My dad was from England, and those things were a big part of the Christmas traditions over there, which we imported. We always had a turkey, too, with wonderful sausage meat stuffing. I still use the same recipe. On Christmas Eve afternoon, my mother always baked wonderful shortbread cookies, and we couldn't have one until the evening. I always put a few of them on a plate before going to bed, and I left it by the kitchen stove. At that time, we didn't have a fireplace, and I remember wondering how Santa would get in without a chimney that had an opening in the kitchen. But my mother assured me that he would find a way. My dad never actually said anything to promote Santa Claus, as he was a very honest man who never ever told me a lie at any time in all my life. One incident I remember when I must have been 6 or 7 was one Christmas Eve afternoon. My mother put a big box of food items onto my little sleigh and told me to pull it up to a small house on our street near the school. She told me to just ring the bell and tell whoever opened the door to take the box from my sleigh and to say Merry Christmas to him or her. I thought it was very strange, and they would wonder what it was all about. But the boy who opened the door was a slightly older one from school, and he was very pleased and thankful. My mother was a kind and humble person. I remember going to bed very excited and running out to the living room in the morning to find what Santa had left for me. There was always one thing that I had especially wanted, like a specific kind of doll, a doll's bed, high chair, etc. Not all the same Christmas. My dolls were always babies. We would feed them, wash them, change them, put them to bed, and take them for walks. When I was a couple of years older, I got a Shirley Temple doll. I liked changing her dresses, Gifts could also include a sleigh or toboggan or similar. Gifts from the cousins usually included a book. I was an avid reader of the Bobbsey Twins series, and a bit later the Nancy Drew and Judy Bolton series. We were never ever bored. My hung-up stocking would contain an orange, an apple, a chocolate bar, and maybe a small trinket of some kind. My sister was born when I was 7, so when she was old enough, we did those things together. After opening our presents, she and I would put the presents for her godmother onto our sleigh and pull it up the street to their house, go in and admire their tree, and then return home with their gifts to us. Shortly before dinner, our favorite aunt, my mother's childless sister, would arrive with her husband and a big armful of presents, which we opened right away and were always delighted. Dinner followed, and we pulled crackers and donned paper hats. The grown-ups had a small glass of red wine with dinner, but my dad only ever took half a glass. The dinner was always perfect, with turkey, mashed potatoes, peas and carrots, and lots of gravy, followed by the Christmas pudding. We were all stuffed after that, and while my mother and aunt cleared up, my sister and I played with our new toys. Either the next day or else at New Year's, we would go to an uncle, aunt, and cousins who lived up the street from us and have a light supper of salad, jellies, cold meat, etc., and then played some action songs. My uncle was very lively, and we had a hilarious time doing 2 fingers, 2 thumbs, keep moving, and one man went to mow, and then singing old songs. As I grew older, we added church to our Christmas routine. I joined a little group of preteens with Miss Florence White at Church of the Resurrection, an Anglican church. Organized a delightful annual Christmas carol service. We sang by candlelight, and it was a very special part of Christmas. Later on, when I was in my teens, I played the organ for the evening services and led a junior choir. We happily carried on the Christmas candlelight service. One time, one of the candles started burning too much, but my uncle's quick thinking saved the day. Also in my teens, I remember our young people's group at church having a sleigh ride. There were lots of empty fields around, and the horses were familiar with the area. In the dark, all the fields looked alike, and all I know is that we went on snow-covered fields. Everything was open then, probably all the way up to the back river. There were spaces between the groups of woods too, so it could have been there. We were talking, laughing, and singing in the dark and not really thinking about where we were. We sang Jingle Bells and other songs while some of the boys got off and ran behind the sleigh. It was nice hearing the horses' bells ring in the clean, crisp, and frosty air as they jogged along. Hot dogs followed at the church. I remember eating 8. I didn't get sick either. On Christmas Eve, too, I was in my late teens. A small group from our church went around the neighborhood singing carols at each house, followed, after changing clothes, by attending the midnight Christmas Eve service. When I got home after that, I always had shortbread and a glass of wine, then off to bed. The day after Christmas and all that week on school vacation between Christmas and New Year, we would go sliding, toboggan or sleigh, down the hill on King's Road, where there was only the one house at the top of the hill, and all the rest of the hill was clear for sliding. When stores gradually opened up in Valois and TV arrived, then things started changing, and Christmas became more secular and advertised. Those things had a big influence on life in Valois. By the time my own kids came along, Valois was, of course, very different, and a visit to Santa was always included. When they were small, too, my aunt in town lived in an apartment on the Eaton Santa Claus parade route, and she always invited us to view it from her living room and balcony. That, of course, was wonderful instead of being freezing cold outside standing around. Then she always gave us cream soda to drink, which was a real treat. One of my small boys called her 3-floored apartment building Auntie May's Castle. By the time my kids were teens and older, things were much the same as at present. My childhood Christmases likely sound very uninspiring, but we all enjoyed them. Just simple pleasures with family and eagerly looked forward to every year. Marguerite.